Hi folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about movies, music, art, and culture. And this time we're going to be talking about the self-titled debut album from the band The 1975. But first, let me quickly clarify something that's been annoying me back from the review of Deer Hunter's Monomania, specifically in reference to vocals. For those of you who haven't taken a look at that review, I mentioned that one of my big pet peeves is that I tend to find it seriously annoying when artists bury the vocals behind production or vocal effects. To me, unless it is specifically done in order to enhance the elements of the song, it comes across as a way to hide the lyrics from deeper examination and just get on my nerves. But what happens when you get a lead singer whose vocals aren't buried, but are just hard to figure out because of his delivery? Well, as I mentioned in that review, I tend to be significantly more forgiving towards them. Now, of course, I have my limits here, but in terms of, say, growling or screamed vocals that you typically find in metal, I tend to be more accommodating, both due to the fact that said delivery is typical of the genre, and that it can be fairly reasonably easy to parse out once you're familiar with it. Or, for another example, take Dexy's Midnight Runners, well known for the quintessential 80s classic Come On Eileen. Lead singer Kevin Rowland's voice might come across as unintelligible, barbaric yelps on first listen, but once you've grown accustomed to his delivery, his lyrics are actually fairly easy to parse out. And it was of Dexy's Midnight Runners that I first thought about when I heard the opening single from the new Manchester-based indie rock act, The 1975. The song titled Chocolate. Not only was it catchy as hell, but the vocals clearly sounded like they'd require some additional listens to fully parse out. And while I tend to go a little easy on debut albums, particularly when they're from indie bands that might not get another second chance if they don't open off very well, I immediately thought that the sound of Chocolate was good enough that they might be able to impress me without the benefit of lower standards. So, with all that in mind, what do I think of the 1975's debut self-titled album? Well, for the most part, it's pretty damn great. And for the most part, I think it achieves its goals. However, I have the sneaking suspicion that it could have been a whole lot better, although it's going to be a little difficult to completely articulate why. Hold on, folks, we're going to go deep for this one. But for those of you who are looking for the short review, here it is. If you like their single Chocolate, you're gonna like this album, because there's a lot more of the same on the 1975. No, it's not quite as good as Franz Ferdinand's Right Thoughts, Right Words, Right Action, but then again, there isn't much that is. For once, I don't think I'm gonna be able to break this album review into my typical chunks of instrumentation, production, delivery, songwriting, and theme, but instead I'm gonna take something more of a holistic approach, which I feel is necessary to get to the meat of why this album, for the most part, works, but just slightly misses the mark. I will say in preface that Matthew Healy's idiosyncratic vocals do become easier to parse out the more you get into the album, and his particular delivery doesn't actually grate on the nerves all that much. Now, frankly, every reviewer on the planet is going to immediately make the comparison of the 1975 with their immediate 80s counterpart, Duran Duran, because on the surface, it works surprisingly well. Both acts have a slick, classy sound driven by a very tight groove, with the 1975 bringing in a rollicking bass line that's placed rather prominently in the mix and played well enough to justify it. Both make irresistibly catchy tunes that stick in the brain no matter how hard you try to get them out. Both sound very much of their time and genre, not so much innovating, but refining the little elements that make them distinctive. I'm going to come back to this because in the 1975 this might require more qualification. And both, despite some pretensions towards depth, are really pop acts at their very core. Now, as I've mentioned a number of times, there's absolutely no stigma with being a pop act. And to their credit, the 1975 have acknowledged this, claiming to draw inspiration from the new wave synth pop of the mid-80s and the power pop of the 70s, both clear influences that are immediately detectable in the instrumentation. If I were to criticize here, I wish more of the power pop energy and broader scope cropped up more in the production, which always seemed a little tighter than it should be on the 1975's more energetic tracks, but really, that's a minor gripe. What needs to be made clear, however, is that the 1975 are not a throwback act in the slightest. They have a distinctly modern sound, albeit tempered by a strong affection of the 1980s. Now, some of you who took a look at my Franz Ferdinand review or from a little bit earlier might raise speculative eyebrows, because I did say that the modern pop scene was much more reflective of the 1970s this year, not the 80s. And that's still true, but the 1975 have opted to take the majority of their inspiration, particularly for their lyrics, from a distinctly 80s cultural institution, John Hughes film. Now, to be honest, this does make a certain amount of sense. After all, if the 1975 were looking to create a soundtrack of their formative years as they've claimed, it makes sense to draw upon one of the most emotionally complex works of one of the most influential filmmakers for teenagers in the 1980s. And here's where I'd argue the Duran Duran comparison breaks down somewhat. The 1975, despite their wholehearted embrace of happy pop music, have a distinctly melancholic edge which comes through in Healy's delivery. It's a little tired, a little world-weary, a little too smart for the room, and it would fit the mood of a John Hughes film instantaneously. But here's where my biggest problem is. Despite the excellent instrumentation and perfect delivery that fits that imaginary John Hughes film, the lyrics don't quite have the necessary subtleties to match it. Oh, don't get me wrong, they're far from bad. Healy has the same rich gift for poetry that characterizes Vampire Weekend, another band attempting to capture that modern cultural zeitgeist. But while the delivery of the songs might suggest that element of melancholy that makes the songs feel richer and more meaningful, the lyrics themselves don't quite rise to that level, sitting more on the surface of that brash, forever young teen anthem context that many people continuously misinterpret John Hughes' films as celebrating, instead of actually analyzing or subverting. You get your songs about teenage romances, causing trouble, late at night drama, and while a few have some pretty imagery, you don't precisely get a lot of depth or deeper insight besides the occasional punchline. And to be honest, it sometimes feels a little shallow. It would fit alongside on a soundtrack of, let's say, Sofia Coppola's The Bling Ring. But then again, that might be part of the point. If one could contextualize the pervading cultural attitudes of my generation right now, you could definitely make the argument that there's a certain inward-looking shallowness and self-absorption. Time magazine called us the me generation, and it's not as if they were far off. And really, if we're looking at a good linkage point between our time and the 1980s, shallow self-obsession is a consistent common element. And I'll say this, on the best tracks of the album, the band does manage to capture a fragment of that deeper subtext that informed John Hughes' material at its best and made it so impacting and relatable to that generation, translating that shallow subject matter into something a little bit more resonant, perfectly nailing that tricky tone that filled Hughes' work and yet modernizing it so it applies to our generation. But for the rest of the album, they don't quite stick the landing, only providing text, not subtext, which does knock the album down a bit more for me. But even with all that, I dug the hell out of the self-titled debut of the 1975. This is an album with a very distinctive flavor of being of two very different times, able to fit both them impressively well. It's a great album, showing some talented songwriting and a stridently catchy sound that would make them an ideal fit for the modern pop landscape. I want to see more from the 1975, and you know what? I get the pleasant feeling that I probably will. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I got more videos on the way. Sorry the 9 Inch Nails video isn't quite here yet. I'm still doing some more analysis because I really want to get this one right. In any case, see you next time.